Okay, let's continue with chapter 6, cellular respiration. It should be a fairly short one. We'll finish up this chapter. It should be 106 respiration 3, I think. So fermentation in microorganisms. I think we left off right here. We talked about lactic acid fermentation, you know, what we do and a lot of animals do. But we'll look at some microorganisms, what they can do. And we put yeast in there, even though yeast is a really strange organism, okay? It's a fungus. And usually we can see fungi, you know, they're not microscopic, but yeast they're unicellular fungi, which is truly bizarre because fungi is one of the three big multicellular kingdoms, except for yeast. They're unicellular fungi. And that makes them unusual. And they also do alcoholic fermentation, which is really unusual. But here's the thing. Yeast and some other organisms can survive with or without oxygen. All right, so we can talk about organisms that have to breathe oxygen, and they're called obligate aerobes. And we fall, and all animals fall in that category, obligate aerobes. They have to breathe this stuff. They can make ATP without oxygen for a while, fermentation, but just for a little bit. Well, some organisms can actually do fermentation for a lot longer than we can. We can hold, you know, we can do it for a few minutes, you know, and also hold your breath. How long can you hold your breath? 2-3 minutes maybe. But there are some organisms that can do for lactic acid fermentation for like hours. Like a turtle, for example, you scare a turtle and it goes down. It's an obligate aerobe, but it can stay underwater for like a couple hours, just holding its breath. Whales, even with the high metabolic rate, whales can go down and hold their breath for hours. Okay, but eventually you have to come up and you got to breathe the stuff. So we're obligate aerobes. Then there are some organisms, I think they're all bacteria, what's called obligate anaerobes. They never use oxygen. They hide from oxygen. And they are some of the nastiest bugs on a plant, and they usually make really foul smelling stuff. If you go to the beach and you dig deep enough, you hit that black layer, that foul smelling black layer, you hit anaerobic land. You go into a swamp and you can smell that swamp gas. That's being made by these anaerobic organisms that are deep in the mud, and there's no oxygen down there. And there's one called Clostridium botulinum that's pretty seriously dangerous. It causes gangrene. If you're part of your body, if the oxygen supply is cut off the part of your body, this bacteria will take over and cause gangrene. And usually when some part of your body turns gangrenous, the tissue is destroyed and you have to amputate that. Also, they make some seriously dangerous compounds. In fact, one of them, well, Clostridium botulinum makes the most toxic thing known to human beings, and that's called botulinum toxin. A tablespoon would be enough to kill everybody in Hagerstown. But remember, it's all on dosage. You know, even innocuous things can be toxic if you take enough of them. And this one is incredibly toxic, but if you take a small amount of it, you can smooth out wrinkles. This is with Botox injections. Botulinum toxin inhibits muscular contraction. And you have to, and remember, you can't, that's one of the things, biological work you have to do. You have to contract muscles. So tiny little bit injected into your face can smooth out these wrinkles, which are due to tiny little muscles that are causing the wrinkles. It's a vanishingly small amount, but it still has an effect. And then you have what's called a facultative aerobe or facultative anaerobe. And I think yeast is the only one I can think of. It says some other organisms survive with or without oxygen. I'm not sure what other organisms facultative. Facultative means you can live indefinitely with oxygen, indefinitely without oxygen. Doesn't matter to you. Right? That's called a facultative aerobe. And yeast is is the really good example of that. And they do what's called alcoholic fermentation. Now, actually, we talked about two types of fermentation, lactic acid and alcoholic. Actually, there are a bunch of really strange organisms like deep in the ocean that carry all kinds of different fermentations. So they might be facultative also. Well, we're going to look at yeast. So waste from fermentation can be ethyl alcohol, lactic acid, or other compounds, depending on the species. So like I said, there's lots of different kinds of fermentation. We're just going to look at lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. And now we're going to look at alcoholic fermentation with yeast. I think we're going to do a yeast fermentation lab this week and next week, depending upon whether you're first or second weeks. So there's lactic acid, ethyl alcohol fermentation. So you have glycolysis as usual. Glycolysis is always part of fermentation. You make two pyruvic acids, but instead of making lactic acid, you make ethyl alcohol and you release CO2. All right? And so remember, aerobic and anaerobic respiration starts with glycolysis. Glycolysis is thus a universal energy harvesting process of life. And the role of glycolysis in respiration fermentation has an evolutionary basis. Between 3.5 and 2.7 billion years ago, before significant levels of oxygen were present in Earth's atmosphere, ancient prokaryotes used glycolysis to make ATP and generate ATP exclusively through glycolysis. And that's what some of these obligate anaerobes still do today. They can live off of those 2 ATPs made in glycolysis. We can't. We got to make more than that. And so glycolysis is probably the oldest energy harvesting process on Earth. Okay, now, so origin of Earth 4.5 billion years ago, oldest prokaryotic fossils 3.5. And they're called prokaryotic, but remember what I said earlier about cells. They probably weren't prokaryotes, they were even simpler, because even prokaryotic cells are very complex. So, but we can call them prokaryotes. But anyway, atmospheric oxygen first appears about 2.5 billion years ago. Oxygen reaches 10% of bottom levels. First eukaryotic organisms. And this is when endosymbiosis probably happened, when the ancient bacteria that were aerobic got mixed with a larger eukaryotic cell, and they became mitochondria and chloroplasts in plants. So the fact that glycolysis occurs in almost every organism suggests that it evolved very early in ancestors common to all the domains of life. And so the location of glycolysis within the cell also implies great antiquity. The pathway does not require any of the membrane enclosed organelles of the eukaryotic cell, right? Because it takes place in the cytoplasm, which evolved more than 1 billion years after the prokaryotic cell. So it's the oldest process. And remember, it's part of fermentation, both lactic acid fermentation, alcoholic fermentation. And let me think more about human interactions with our friendly yeast. So if you take yeast and you give it sugar and water, or some form of carbohydrate and water and oxygen, what do you make? Bread. Right? What are the little holes in leavened bread are from CO2 made by the yeast? You're baking bread. What if you give that organism the same carbohydrate, water, and no oxygen? What do you make? Beer or wine. That's what you make. Make alcoholic beverages. And like I said, that can be done indefinitely. But here's the thing, alcohol becomes toxic after a while to these organisms. So at about 5-6% for most yeast, that level of alcohol is toxic and the yeast die. So in beer and wine, they're dead yeast. They're not still alive. If you would somehow remove the alcohol from that mixture and get them supplied with carbohydrate and water, they could live forever without oxygen. But they're killed at 5-6. Some yeast can make up to like 8, 9, 10%. That's where you get these really strong beers and wines that come up to like a 12%. But how do you get to 40%? Like in whiskey and rum and vodka? Well, that's distilled beverages. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature than water, so you can boil the alcohol mixture. You capture the alcohol in condensing tubes, and it drips off, and you get distilled spirits. So that's it. You can make your own beer or wine at home. I've done it. As long as you don't sell it. Don't try to sell it, because then the government can after you. But you can't distill alcohol. That's against the law. But we have had a huge, long history with alcoholic beverages. I mean, the very earliest recipe ever found, I think, in Sumerian tablets, is a recipe for beer. Particularly in ancient Europe, in medieval Europe, alcohol was a very important product because something unusual about alcohol, it's caloric. It's actually energy yielding. In fact, it's quite energy yielding. It's more energy yielding than carbohydrates, not as much as fat. 7 kcals per gram. And so really, alcohol beverages are like liquid bread. And here's the thing, you try to store grain in the ancient world, you can't store this stuff because there's no refrigeration. And all these fungi come in there and destroy it, and bacteria. But what if you make beer or wine out of it? How long does that last? It's really a preservative mechanism for calories. So you can preserve calories by making alcoholic beverages. Also, the ancient cities of Europe were just cesspools. I mean, they threw their feces and urine right out the window. It's running. It was incredibly filthy and dangerous, and they had an incredible infant mortality rate. If you lived to your infant years, to make it to 5 years of age, you had a really good immune system. And also, all the water is toxic, is putrid. It's got filled with bacteria, but the beer isn't, because the alcohol kills the bacteria. So if you drink water, you die from cholera or hepatitis A or some kind of dread waterborne disease. You drink beer or wine instead, it's pure, it's less bacteria, you live longer. So this is where the European tolerance for alcohol came out. If you drink more and more alcohol, you become more tolerant to it because you have these inducible enzyme systems. And so that really helped people and that's why Europeans have this greater tolerance for alcohol than Asians or particularly Native Americans. It's really unfortunate that Native Americans never invented fermentation, and so the Europeans came over there, brought their alcohol with them, and with tragic consequences to the Native Americans. But anyway, they also brought all these diseases over and wiped out huge nations of people with their diseases. But anyway, so we have had a long history with alcoholic beverages with our friend, the yeast, also with bread, making bread. Okay, so I think that's it. That's it for chapter 6. So this should be 106 respiration 3, remember. And it's a short one. I'll put this one up. And so we can stop now, and I'll see you later.